Well, it's certainly an interesting season and an interesting Sunday in which all of us have a little bit of anxiety over the next few days. In 1992, I moved from Florida to Ohio. I was born and raised in Ohio, but I ended up spending about 6 years in Florida. And I moved back to Ohio in 1992. I was hired as news director of a radio station there. It was a Christian radio network. And one of my first responsibilities, it was in the fall of 1992. You remember what happens in the fall of 1992? One of the first responsibilities I had, one of the big ones, in fact, I was almost as soon as I hit the door, what are we going to do about elections? Election coverage was what I was tasked with. And election coverage, especially in those presidential elections, if you're involved in radio or TV, it's an absolute zoo. It's probably the busiest and most stressful night of the year. It's an absolute zoo. But if you remember anything about that election in 1992, the one thing I do remember about that particular election is that this was the election that was going to end the world. It was pushed as this is the election of all elections. This is the election to end the world. The world hangs in the balance between, remember who? George Bush and Mr. Clinton. And that was the thinking. That was the mindset. I remember we covered it that night. And again, you get to the end of it and you're really tired. By the way, it was a zoo in 2000. Remember that one? I didn't get to go to bed till like 3 or 4 in the morning. The election hadn't been called. Remember that one? But in 1992, I remember waking up the next morning and thinking, you know what? The world didn't come to an end. What happened? I thought again, that was the way in every presidential election since then, especially those ones in transition, like 2000, 2008. It's always, hey, this is the big one. It's like the California earthquake. It's coming. Once again, we're being told that this is an unprecedented election. No election ever like it. In one sense, it's true. We've never had an election that involved these two guys running against each other. But in a sense, it is not. In a sense, we've had this hype before. We've seen this hype before, and so we have the hype again. Unprecedented is a word that I am not comfortable with for a lot of reasons, but one of which is the worldview that goes with unprecedented is that this has never ever happened before. We've got a text here that tells us otherwise. We come to believe that that's part of a worldview that we have. In fact, we got a movie, I don't know how many of you know the Bee Movie, but those of you that have seen the Bee Movie, kind of the underlying presupposition, we are supposed to feel uncomfortable with doing everything the same thing at the same time all the time, and that's our life, and that's kind of the rhythm of our lives. We are coached to think, and of course the bee spends the entire movie trying to get out of that box, and we're supposed to not feel comfortable with that rhythm. I can guarantee you this morning, as soon as Troy walks in with a dog, today is unprecedented. There is something unprecedented in every day, if we look at it. Yes, there is the rhythm of, especially with our vocations in which things are the same. But if we just open our eyes and we look, every day is unprecedented. There's a new conversation. There is something new that has happened. There's a new opportunity, even in the little things. So every day is unprecedented. I love today's precedents. This is awesome. Troy, and by the way, that's an answer to prayer, right? Amen. Answer to prayer. Dog was lost about a few weeks ago, and we prayed, and dog came home. So we need to keep that in mind as we come to our text this morning. You see, we're being told this election is unprecedented, and it's not simply confirmation, it's a symptom of the anxiety that we feel. And I'm talking to both sides of the aisle. And I've been saying this for a few weeks now, and I'm going to say it again today. On Wednesday, half of us are going to be disappointed. Half of us. Half of us are not going to want to get up on Wednesday. And so today's lesson from Daniel is for Wednesday. Again, both sides. And that anxiety. How are we to think about Wednesday? And if it's true for Wednesday, then obviously it's true for the rest of our lives. Now, our story today takes place about 18 years after last week's Bible lesson. In last week's Bible talk, we were looking at Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is watching the city of Jerusalem burn. You know, the temple's been destroyed. The Babylonians have come and they've wiped out a lot of the city, and they've taken the rest into captivity as slaves, and they've absolutely reduced the city to ruins. They've destroyed the temple, taken it off its foundation. It's toast. Our story today is 18 years prior to that. You see, the Babylonians, they didn't just show up in 586 BC to take out Israel. This was a slow drip. This was a slow process. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar, who was he ran the whole thing. He was the world. They're the world empire at the time. They are the Rome of their time. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he starts off with Israel as, you know what? Where I'm going to let you keep your king, kind of a puppet king arrangement. I'm going to let you keep your king. I'm going to let you keep your temple. You pay your taxes. You play nice, we'll play nice. Now, even amongst that, though, he starts draining the country. He takes the gold out of the temple. He takes the gold out of the palace. The gold out of the temple, by the way, which becomes part of this story, the gold in the temple ends up in the temple of the Babylonians, to the false gods. The people in Israel are horrified. So he starts to drain the economy. There's a brain drain. So the nation's elite, Israel's elite, they get taken to Babylon. And he is going to use those guys in his economy. And that's where this story today picks up. So I'd be thinking 18 years before last week, 18 years before Jerusalem falls, Nebuchadnezzar's already beginning taking people out of the country. And that's where our story begins this morning. We meet Daniel, and he's got 3 friends, and we're going to see what happens to those 4 guys. Mike is going to read for us.
In the 3rd day of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The Lord handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to him, along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels in the treasures of his God. The king ordered Aspenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility. A young man without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them.
Chaldean.
He was to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years. At the end of that time, they were to attend the king. Among them, from the Judeans, were Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names. He named them Balthasar to Daniel, to Shadrach, to Hananiah, Meshach, to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah.
All right. So dealing with Babylonian names and Jewish names, we're not used to dealing with that, but neither were they. That becomes part of this story. So you got 4 of Israel's elite. These are 4 Ivy Leaguers in that day. 4 Ivy Leaguers that are carted off as part of this brain drain. And they get stuck in Babylon's highest court. The king is going to use these 4 Ivy Leaguers to help his economy. He's going to use them to work at some of the highest levels. But these guys, and right off the bat you see this, there's a tension here. These guys are Hebrews. These guys are Israelites. And if you're reading this in that day, if you're one of those Israelites reading this from Daniel, you've got a bit of unease here. There's a bit of tension. You begin to have a sense. How are these Hebrews, how are these Israelites going to live among these filthy Babylonians in dealing with their terrible gods? Well, it says here, they're going to learn the language. They're going to take on the king's diet. They're going to have Babylonian names. He renames them. In fact, if you know anything about these names, these are the names of Babylonian gods. He's giving them names of the gods that they worship. What is a Hebrew, what is a Jew to do in that situation? So you begin to get the sense, what's going to happen? And at the back of everybody's mind is, has God gone missing? Does God care? Does God have these 4 guys in mind? Has he left them to their own devices? Well, no. We're told right away in the midst of this story and chronicling for us, it says this: the Lord handed King Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord handed. The Lord handed. This is God's doing. God's allowing this to happen. In fact, you're absolutely mortified now. Now that you begin to think this way, you're kind of mortified this is happening, because if God is handing Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar, well, then he's also allowing the temple to be stripped of all its gold and all of its furniture. He's allowing it to end up in Babylonian temples with false gods. What is going on? But this is unthinkable for them. He's allowing this to happen. But God handed him over. God is still ruling. God is still in the works. So much so that this also becomes part of the story of these 4 guys. So this happens next. Mike?
Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch to not defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my Lord, the king who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner? Okay? And the other young man you ate. You would endanger my life for the king. So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food. And deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove the food and the wine, and they were to drink, and gave them vegetables.
All right. So, what is an Israelite to do in this situation? They seemingly are good with the new gig. They seemingly are good, working in the king's court. They seemingly are good with the new name, their new names. Although, one interesting thing that you don't see here in our English is that they tweak the endings of these God names, so it's almost as if they probably even protested a little bit about bearing the names of Babylonian gods, but they're good with that. What they aren't good with is the food. Now, there's nothing wrong with this food. Let's just get that right out of the way. Nothing wrong with the food that they're being asked. It's what is normally done with this food. This is food that is served to idols. They're not good with this. The Israelite is not good with eating food that has been dedicated to the false gods. They're not about to validate the worship of somebody who is not the one true God. So Daniel proposes the V8 test. We're going to drink the Tom Brady drink, right? The green stuff. And so that's what happens. Now it's very easy for us to come to this, and we see what happens to these guys, and we begin to think, oh, look at what they're doing. They should be rewarded. And oh, by the way, is it really the drinks? Is it really the drinks? It says they looked better and healthier. So does that mean we should all become vegan? This is not about the drinks. In fact, the text does not allow us to go there, because even the language here is they looked healthier. To who? You see, all along the way, remember how we said God's hand is in all of this? That is a running theme throughout the entire book of Daniel. In fact, Daniel at one point says, God is the one who raises up kings, and He's the one who deposes kings. God is a ruler, God has an eternal kingdom, and He rules human kingdoms. And those three things are always in play in the book of Daniel. And those three things are here in this story. This is the theme of Daniel. It says, God granted Daniel and his friends kindness and compassion with the chief eunuch, the guy that was in charge of the big contest. He is working on that guy's heart so that Daniel and his friends have kindness and compassion. Daniel and his friends are not producing the kindness and compassion with that eunuch. God is. God's hand is in this. It's not the drinks. It's not Daniel and his friends. This is God's doing. And the next thing you know, Daniel and his friends are at the top of the economic food chain. They're now working in the highest place in the king's court. Here's what happens next. Michael.
God gave these four young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of time, that king had said, present them. And the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. began to attend the king. In every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
All right. So, because we are results oriented, because we are all interested in producing, we live in a culture that produces or that prizes production and results. It's very easy for us to see Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. It's very easy for us to see all four of those guys as being at the top here as a result, again, of who they are, what they do, and the choice they have made. And again, the text does not allow us to go there. At the very beginning of this section, we are told that God gave these four young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature. In fact, the wording here, every kind of literature, knowledge and understanding, he gave them wisdom and understanding. He gave them knowledge, how-to, awareness, wisdom that is beyond normal capacity. This is a supernatural thing going on here. God gives. God gifts these young men. God is not simply rewarding them. This is grace. Whenever you see God gives, that's grace. God gifts these young men with the knowledge and the wisdom to accomplish his purposes because he is still orchestrating all things from the heavens. He is gifting them. He is giving them compassion and kindness in the eyes of their captors. He's also gifting them with knowledge and understanding so that his purposes will be accomplished in the courts of the king. You see, this is not Daniel and his friends, and sometimes we come to a story like this, and I have heard this, taught this way, that Daniel and his friends are making lemonade out of lemons. All along the way, remember, God handed Jehoiakim over. God has been orchestrating. God's the one orchestrating the movement of four guys, pulling them out of everything they know, their homes, their schooling, their education, their friends, their families, pulling them out of that context, placing them in a context that is not their own, in a language that is not their own, in a culture that is not their own, with names that are not their own. He's doing that. He has done this for his purposes. And we get the sense then, because he's orchestrating this, this is part of his grace. These are part of his purposes, and there is a piece here that we will miss, and if we miss this, we do miss what God is doing here. There's one more clue here that God is working, and it's very easy for us to run right over it. But if you're sitting there in a gathering listening to this from Daniel in that day, and you hear this, all of a sudden, your heart starts to get a lump. We don't see it, but it's here. It's that very last phrase. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. King Cyrus. Now, if you're sitting there in this gathering, you hear the word Cyrus, and you start to get goosebumps. And you want to know why? Who's on the throne in the story? It's Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar is ruling the world. That is not going to always be the case. And if you're listening there, if you're in the gathering and you're listening to this, Cyrus is a name that you have heard because prophets have talked about Cyrus. The prophets have talked about Cyrus in a way of hope. Because Cyrus is going to be the one who brings Israel back to Jerusalem. Cyrus is going to be the one who's going to rebuild Jerusalem. Cyrus is going to be the one who is going to begin the rebuilding of the temple. Cyrus is going to be the one who saves Israel. Cyrus in the scriptures is a savior. So you want to know why God is handing Jehoiakim over? You know, want to know why God is gifting these young men to work in the highest places of Babylon? Because he's at work in the salvation of his people. It's all about redemption. It's all about salvation. And here in the middle of another story, the author, Daniel, is reminding people this is not all there is in this story. The reason all these things are going down, the reason all these things are happening this way is because God is interested in the salvation and redemption of his people. Cyrus. Don't forget Cyrus as you read this story. We're not even out of the first story of Daniel, and we're being reminded that God is always about the redemption and salvation of his people. The gospel is always in play. The gospel cannot be thwarted. The gospel is unstoppable. That is Cyrus in this story. A reminder that God always has his gospel going. So, this Wednesday, and we got another visitor here, don't we? This Wednesday, remind yourself, God is ruler over human kingdoms. God is ruler over human kingdoms. He sets up rulers, he sets them down. He is in charge of all things. He has his kingdom. And come back to this story and remind yourself of Cyrus. Because hundreds of years later, there is another Cyrus. There is a new Cyrus who comes. And he is the king. And he is setting up his kingdom. And when he dies, over his head this is the king of the Jews. And this new Cyrus has taught us to pray. Your kingdom come, your will be done. On earth as it is in heaven. Jesus rules it all. And in the pages of the New Testament, we see this new Cyrus coming, and he is establishing his kingdom, and he has established it in his death and his resurrection. He rules, he has his eternal kingdom, and he rules over human kingdoms. Still, the gospel is unstoppable. The gospel cannot be thwarted. So what happens on Tuesday will not stop the gospel. It's of another kingdom. The gospel cannot be thwarted. Christ's kingdom has no stake in what happens on Tuesday. On Wednesday, remind yourself when you wake up that Christ's kingdom is still here. The gospel is still unstoppable. It's the gospel that matters. The gospel is unstoppable. Now, for some of you, it's quite possible, and I'm sure this is true, that the elections, that's not the big deal in your life right now, but it's either a relationship, something is out of your control, something is unnerving you at work, something is unnerving you at home, you have anxiety. You, me, we still got to come back to this text and remind us of who Cyrus is for Daniel and his three friends. We remind ourselves of the new Cyrus who is still in control of human kingdoms, our kingdoms. That no matter what happens in our lives, it may be out of our control, but there is still somebody who is divinely orchestrating all things for his redemption and salvation among his people. The gospel's unstoppable. God is ruler over all things. Christ rules. Christ has his eternal kingdom. And Christ reigns over human kingdoms. He reigns over human lives, including yours and mine. And we can rest on that promise this week, regardless of whether it's the elections or something going on in our lives. He is there as a ruler for us. And this ruler isn't simply orchestrating all things. He is with us. He cares. He loves us. He gives us grace. He gives us mercy. He gives us peace, forgiveness, over and over again. That's who Christ is for us in his kingdom. Let's pray.